Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here, glad to find you in this quiet hour. Tell me, is there a document before you this evening, a letter perhaps, or something set aside to be read when the day relents? There is a particular kind of truth that hides in dates and signatures, in the small precise marks we trust without question. Watson knew it well. Do subscribe so no detail escapes us together. Now, settle in. For as Holmes believed, the law may be a machine, but truth requires reason always. You'll find the Watson's Margins Spotify link in the description below. Chapter 1. The Quiet House in Bedford Square. It is a singular fact, which I have observed across many years of companionship with Mr. Sherlock Holmes, that the most disturbing affairs arrive on the quietest of mornings. Had any man stepped into our sitting room at 221B Baker Street on that particular Tuesday in late January, he would have encountered a scene of almost monastic serenity. The fire burned steadily in the grate. Outside, a thin crust of snow lay upon the window ledges and the iron railings of the street below, softening the city's habitual clamour to a muffled and distant murmur. I was settled in my armchair with the morning papers, and Holmes was at his chemical bench, absorbed in an experiment which had occupied him, with varying degrees of intensity for the better part of 3 days. I had long since stopped inquiring into the precise nature of these experiments. Holmes conducted them with the same focused detachment he brought to everything he did not wish to explain, occasionally making a note in his cramped hand, occasionally muttering something beneath his breath, and occasionally fixing upon his specimen a gaze of such concentrated attention that it seemed he might reduce it to its constituent elements by will alone. I could see from where I sat a small rack of glass files arranged with precision, and beside them a monograph, partially annotated, whose title, glimpsed at a certain angle when he had set it down the previous evening, appeared to concern the oxidation of iron gall ink under varying conditions of temperature and humidity. It was, I reflected, exactly the sort of inquiry that would seem wholly purposeless to the world at large, and yet which I had come, over many years, to regard with considerable respect. It was shortly after 11 o'clock when Mrs. Hudson knocked, and, without awaiting a reply, admitted a young man whose appearance announced both professional ambition and present anxiety. He was perhaps 30 years of age, slight of build, and dressed in the sober black of the legal profession. His hat was damp at the brim, suggesting recent exposure to weather he had not anticipated, and he held a slender leather document case with the careful grip of a man who had been warned not to damage it. His face was pale, with a particular pallor that belongs not to illness but to sleeplessness and worry. Holmes did not turn from his bench. "Pray sit down, Mr. Harrowby," said he. "You will find the basket chair adequate if you push the volume of Blackstone to one side. You have come from Bedford Square, I perceive, by way of Oxford Street rather than by the more direct route, which suggests either that you wish to compose yourself before arriving, or that you passed by your firm's offices to collect that case before deciding to come here." The young man sat down with an expression of startled gratitude that I recognised at once as the common response of those encountering Holmes for the first time. "Both are true, Mr. Holmes," he said. "My name is Elias Harrowby. I am a junior solicitor with the firm of Harrowby and Vale, of which my father is the senior partner. You have heard of Sir Reginald Peveril, I dare say." Holmes at last turned from his bench and settled himself in his chair, with the air of a man whose attention once given is absolute. "The retired magistrate," said he, "a man of considerable reputation, and of somewhat less considerable mercy, if the bar's private opinion is to be credited. He is dead, I take it." Harrowby blinked. "He is, Mr. Holmes. 2 days since, at his home in Bedford Square. The death itself is not in question. He was elderly, his heart had been a matter of concern for some time, and his physician has certified death from natural causes without hesitation. It is not the death which has brought me to you, but something found among his papers in the aftermath." He opened the document case with care and produced a single folded sheet, which he laid upon the table. It was a judicial order, set out in the formal manner of the courts, signed in a firm hand, and sealed with an official seal now partially cracked with age. Holmes did not touch it. He bent forward slightly and examined it from a distance of some 6 inches, his grey eyes moving with that rapid precision which never failed to arrest my attention, even after so long an acquaintance. "The date," said Holmes. "The 14th of March, 1887, said Harrowby. "We believe it should read the 15th. The difference of 1 day is, on its face, a trivial matter. In practice, it is anything but." Harrowby then explained the case of Edwin Larch, a man convicted some years earlier under circumstances which had not been, as he delicately phrased it, without their controversy. On the 15th of March in that year, a formal petition had been lodged with the court, seeking a stay of Larch's punishment on grounds of procedural irregularity. It had been a properly submitted petition, witnessed and sealed. If the judicial order bearing Sir Reginald's signature had been issued on the 14th, it was prior to the petition, and Peveril had acted within the strict boundaries of his authority. If it had been issued on the 15th, and subsequently misdated whether by error or by design, then the petition had already been before the court when Peveril signed his order, and the magistrate had either ignored it or had deliberately acted to prevent Larch's appeal from being heard. The distinction, Harrowby made plain, was not academic. It bore upon the validity of the conviction, upon the legality of a subsequent transfer of property, and upon the reputation of a man who had spent the remainder of his career constructing an edifice of juridical propriety. Sir Reginald was not, Harrowby said, with the careful precision of a man choosing his words in full consciousness of their weight, a man who inspired universal affection. He was known to be severe, to be exacting, and to possess a command of legal technicality that was perhaps employed upon occasion more in the service of particular interest than of abstract justice. Several families were badly used by his decisions over the course of his career. Whether the order before you is misdated by innocent error, by negligence, or by something more deliberate, I cannot say. Holmes straightened in his chair and steepled his fingers in the manner I knew so well. "You have brought this to me, Mr. Harrowby, rather than to the police. I am curious to know why." "Because, Mr. Holmes, I am not at all certain that a crime has been committed in the legal sense, but I'm quite certain that something has been done, either now or in the past, which someone wished to conceal, and which has recently been arranged so that it would be found." The folder in which this order was discovered was labelled for destruction in Sir Reginald's own hand. Yet here it is, in plain sight. I am not at all sure that it arrived there by accident. Holmes exchanged a brief glance with me, and I saw in his expression that rapid brightening which I had learned to associate with cases that departed from the ordinary. He asked perhaps a dozen questions in quick succession, most of them apparently unrelated to the matter at hand, concerning the arrangement of Peveril's study, the hours kept by the household, the identity of those present on the evening of the old man's death, and the current disposition of his estate. At the end of this interrogation, Holmes rose abruptly. "Watson," said he, "your coat, if you please. Mr. Harrowby, you will accompany us to Bedford Square. The document can remain here for the present. I have seen what I needed to see in it, and I should prefer that no further hands disturb it." As we descended the stairs into the cold January air and the waiting cab, I confess I was already turning the matter over in my mind. An old judicial order, a misdated signature, a man recently dead. It seemed on the surface a matter for archivists rather than detectives, but I had known Holmes long enough to understand that the surface of a matter, in his estimation, was rarely the matter itself. The snow had begun again as we crossed Oxford Street, falling in fine dry flakes that settled upon the cab roof and dissolved against the windows. Somewhere in Bedford Square, behind the orderly face of a respectable house, something had been arranged with considerable care by a person who wished us to find it, and perhaps also to understand it, in a very particular way. Holmes said nothing during the journey. He sat with his chin upon his chest and his eyes half closed, and I did not disturb him. Chapter 2. A Household Without Disorder. Bedford Square in January presents a face of considerable dignity. The plane trees stand bare along its central garden, their upper branches finely traced against a pale sky, and the Georgian terraces that enclose it on all four sides maintain, even in the depths of winter, an air of deliberate and well-funded composure. Number 14 was a house of the better sort. Freshly painted railings, a brass knocker polished to a high lustre, and stone steps whose whitened edges spoke of a household that attended to appearances as a matter of principle rather than mere habit. It was, I thought, precisely the sort of house in which a retired magistrate would choose to end his days. Harrowby had sent word ahead. We were received at the door by a manservant of middle age whose manner was that particular blend of courtesy and reserve which long service in a formal household tends to produce, and conducted through a hall of considerable width to a drawing-room on the first floor where those members of the household who were present had been assembled at our request. Holmes entered the room without ceremony and stood for a moment near the door, his gaze moving about it in that rapid, comprehensive fashion which most people mistake for mere curiosity. I knew better. He was reading the room as another man might read a page of print, noting the positions of chairs, the arrangement of ornaments upon the mantel, the slight asymmetry of a writing table that had recently been moved and not quite correctly replaced, and half a dozen other details I could not have enumerated, but which I was certain had already been catalogued and filed in that extraordinary mind. The company that awaited us was composed as follows. Lady Marian Peveril sat nearest the fire, a woman of perhaps 60, dressed in the full black of recent bereavement, with a composure so complete that it seemed less a quality of character than a decision made and adhered to. Her hands rested upon her lap without fidgeting, and her eyes, when they met mine, were intelligent, sober, and entirely without appeal for sympathy. Arthur Peveril occupied a chair slightly removed from the rest of the group, as though he had sat down wherever he found himself standing when asked to sit. He was perhaps 35, with a frank, open face that might have been handsome under other conditions, and was currently arranged in the careful expression of a man performing grief while privately considering practical matters. He was the nephew, and, Harrowby had indicated, the principal heir to whatever the estate would yield after examination. Miss Clara Vane was the most immediately striking figure in the room, though not by any vulgarity of dress or manner. She was young, not more than 26 or 27, with dark eyes and a stillness about her that was not the stillness of composure but of containment. She held a pair of gloves in her hands and turned them slowly as she sat, betraying by that small motion a controlled agitation which the rest of her presented no evidence of. Her father, as Harrowby had explained to us in the cab, had lost both his livelihood and his standing as a consequence of a ruling Sir Reginald had delivered some years before, and Miss Vane had subsequently been taken in by Peveril as a ward in what Harrowby had described with careful neutrality as an arrangement whose precise moral character was not easy to define. Mr. Jonas Thorne stood rather than sat, positioned near the window with his hands clasped behind his back, and his walking-stick leaning against the wall at his side. He was a spare man of 50, his face deeply lined and his expression one of vigilant attention, as though he had spent so many years ensuring that legal papers were precisely in order that he had come to apply the same standard to the world in general. He had served as Sir Reginald's clerk for more than 2 decades, and the deference of his posture was so thoroughly habitual that it had ceased to communicate deference at all, and had become simply his manner of occupying space. Reverend Silas Bell sat beside the empty fireplace at the far end of the room, a heavy-set man in clerical black whose round, earnest face was marked by an anxiety he was attempting, with limited success, to disguise as pastoral concern. He had known Sir Reginald for 30 years, he told us, when Holmes inquired. He was a man of evident goodwill and evident unease, and the combination interested me. Inspector Lestrade arrived some 20 minutes after us and greeted Holmes with the mixture of professional respect and personal scepticism that characterized all their dealings. He had already spoken with the physician and the servants, and his view of the matter was plain. Sir Reginald had died of heart failure, which his health had long predicted, and the matter of the judicial order was most probably a clerical error of no great consequence. He said this with an air of finality that left room, as Lestrade's finalities generally did, for Holmes to improve upon it. Holmes said very little during the initial exchange with the household. He asked each person in turn a question or two of apparently slight significance, concerning the arrangement of Sir Reginald's evenings, the habits of the servants, the condition of the study on the morning the body was discovered. The questions were so mild in their construction that several of those present seemed to relax perceptibly after answering, as though they had been braced for something more severe and found the examination beneath their fears. I watched Holmes throughout, and I watched the household watching Holmes, and I thought that for a room full of people who had come to assist an inquiry, there was a remarkable degree of careful assistance on display. Each answer was given promptly and without apparent evasion, yet each was also precisely calibrated. Nobody said more than was asked, and nobody less. It was, I reflected, a room full of people who had already decided what they were willing to say. Holmes excused himself from the company and asked Harrowby to show him Sir Reginald's study. I accompanied them. The room was on the ground floor at the rear of the house, and it continued the theme of the household generally, everything in its appointed place, surfaces cleared, papers arranged in their folders upon the shelves with their labels outward. A large desk occupied the centre of the room, its leather surface clean and dry. The blotter upon it was new, its edges unsoiled. On the mantelpiece stood a clock of good quality, its pendulum still. Holmes moved through the room without touching anything for some minutes, simply looking. He examined the clock, the desk, the carpet before the fireplace, and the two leather-bound folders upon the corner of the desk. He crouched briefly to examine the carpet near the desk leg on the left side, then straightened without comment. He looked at the ink bottle in the desk stand, then at the dried pen in its tray, then at the window latch, then at the small iron grate, which was clean but not entirely empty. At last he turned to me with an expression I could not precisely read. It was not satisfaction, for he had not yet found what he was looking for, nor was it perplexity. It was the look of a man who has confirmed a suspicion he had hoped to find contradicted. "The blotter is new," I said, since he did not speak. "Within the last 4 days," said Holmes. "Observe the slight contraction at the left corner where it has been trimmed to fit the case. It was cut from a larger sheet, which is not how this household does things. Every other piece of equipment in this room, Watson, has been here for years. The pen tray is worn at the base. The ink bottle is the same pattern purchased in quantity from the same supplier. Somebody obtained a new blotter in some haste and did not have time to acquire one of the correct size." He said nothing further on the subject. As we made our way back towards the drawing-room, he paused once in the corridor and looked back towards the study door with that distant expression which told me his thoughts were already several steps ahead of the evidence. "There is too much order here, my dear fellow," said he, in a tone almost of regret. "Disorder may be natural. Perfect order is often manufactured." I followed him back into the drawing-room where Lady Marian Peveril was waiting with the patience of a woman who had spent a long marriage learning to wait, and where Reverend Bell had moved his chair, I noticed, so that it no longer faced the door directly. Chapter 3. The Order That Changed a Life. We did not linger long at Bedford Square that first afternoon. Holmes had seen what he came to see, and the particular alertness that settled upon him in the cab returning to Baker Street told me that he was already engaged in the interior work of arrangement and comparison that preceded in his method any further action in the world. He spoke only once during the journey, to ask me whether I had noted the position of the walking-stick belonging to Mr. Jonas Thorne, and when I confessed that I had not attended to it with any particular care, he nodded as though my answer had confirmed something and returned to his thoughts. Back at Baker Street, he retrieved the judicial order from the table where Harrowby had left it, and carried it to the window, where the afternoon light, though thin and already failing, was at least natural. I settled in my chair and watched him work. He examined the document first with the naked eye, tilting it at several angles to catch the light across its surface, then produced his lens and bent over it with the focused stillness of a scholar deciphering an obscure text. After perhaps 10 minutes, he set it down without comment and went to his shelves, returning with a slim volume whose title I recognised as a technical treatise on the manufacture and composition of legal inks, published by a firm of law stationers. He consulted 2 pages, nodded once and put it aside. "Sit down, Watson," said he, though I was already sitting, "and let me tell you what we are actually dealing with, because I think you have not yet seen it whole." I drew my chair a little closer to the lamp. The Edwin Larch affair, Holmes explained, was of an older vintage than Harrowby had suggested in his condensed account. Larch had been a man of modest means, a land agent by profession, who in the spring of 1887 had been convicted of fraudulently misrepresenting the boundaries of a property in a transaction that had cost his employer a considerable sum. The conviction itself was not, Holmes had gathered from certain documents Harrowby had supplied, beyond the reach of legal argument. The evidence was circumstantial, the identifying testimony thin, and the presiding magistrate had applied the relevant statute in a manner which at least 2 of Peveril's contemporaries at the bar had considered, in private correspondence, to be of doubtful soundness. The petition filed on the 15th of March in that year had been the work of a solicitor named Gibbs, since deceased, who had obtained new evidence bearing upon the reliability of the principal witness. Properly heard, the petition might well have succeeded. It was dated, witnessed, and delivered to the court offices before noon. Sir Reginald's judicial order, confirming the sentence and closing the matter, bore the date of the 14th. If that date was accurate, the order had been signed before the petition arrived and could not be faulted on procedural grounds. If it was not accurate, if the order had in fact been executed on the 15th, with full knowledge that a petition was already before the court, then Peveril had done something considerably more serious than err in a date. "The consequences for Larch?" I asked. "Imprisonment, loss of livelihood, the destruction of what little he had managed to accumulate, and subsequent death in conditions that could not be described as comfortable, some 4 years after his release." Holmes paused. "And for the family of Miss Clara Vane, whose father served as a character witness for Larch at the original trial, and was publicly discredited in the process, the consequences were social and financial ruin." Sir Reginald's remarks from the bench regarding the quality of character testimony in that case were reported in the legal press and did not lack for sharpness. I considered this for a moment. The picture that emerged was not a pleasant one, and yet it was, in its essentials, the picture of a man who had used the law's own instruments to produce an outcome the law itself might not have sanctioned, and had done so in such a way that nothing could be proved without a document that, until 2 days ago, had been marked for burning. "Then who placed it where it would be found?" I said. "That is the first question," Holmes agreed. "The second is who altered the blotter, and why. The third is what the ink will tell us once I have completed a comparison that I have already begun in my mind and will confirm tomorrow morning with materials I do not presently have in this room." He would say nothing more specific than that, which I knew from long experience was not coyness but genuine methodological caution. Holmes never announced a conclusion before the evidence had completed its argument. I turned instead to the matter of motive, which was somewhat easier ground. Among the household we had met that afternoon, the possibilities were neither few nor simple. Arthur Peveril's interest was financial and the most direct. Scandal attaching to his uncle's memory might have various effects upon the estate, depending on how far the original Larch affair could be made the subject of legal proceedings. If Peveril's conduct had been merely harsh, the estate was untouched. If it could be shown that the order was deliberately misdated to prevent a legitimate appeal, the ground became less certain. Arthur's air of cautious relief when Holmes had asked mild questions rather than severe ones had not escaped me, though I was not yet sure what precise anxiety his relief reflected. Clara Vane's motive was of a different character entirely, and I found myself returning to the way her hands had moved upon those gloves when Larch's name had entered the conversation, though nobody had spoken it aloud at the time. Holmes had merely described the case in general terms, but Miss Vane had stiffened at the description before the specifics were offered, which told its own story about her familiarity with the matter. Jonas Thorne's loyalty to Sir Reginald had seemed, at the time of our interview entire and habitual, yet I recalled Holmes's question about the walking stick, and I recalled also that Thorne had said with some precision that he had stood at the study door on the evening of Peveril's death, and had not advanced into the room. It was a detail specific enough to be deliberate. Men who have done nothing irregular do not generally supply the geometry of their innocence unsolicited. As for Reverend Bell, I had formed no settled view. His nervousness was patent, and in my experience a clergyman's anxiety in the presence of a detective can mean almost anything, from genuine concealment to the simple discomfort of a conscientious man who knows more than he feels he may say. Holmes rose from his chair and went to the mantelpiece, taking down his pipe but not filling it, turning it in his fingers as he occasionally did when thinking through a complex sequence. "The document was meant to be found," said he. "That much is plain. But consider the refinement of it, Watson. It was placed in a folder marked for destruction, not hidden therefore, not displayed, placed precisely where a thorough examination of the papers would reveal it, and a casual examination would not. Someone calibrated the discovery. To what end? That depends entirely on what the discoverer was expected to do with it." He set the pipe down on the mantel. "If the object was simple exposure, the document would have been delivered to the press, or to a solicitor with instructions. Instead, it sits in its folder, in a house full of people with competing reasons to either reveal or suppress it, and waits for somebody to ask the right questions." He said nothing further that evening, but after I had retired, I lay for some time in the dark and thought about Edwin Larch, who had died in poor conditions, having perhaps been denied the only honest hearing he would ever have received, and about a date on a piece of paper that was either the record of an honest act or the evidence of a considered one, and I found that the case had begun to trouble me in a way that went somewhat beyond professional interest. Somewhere in Bedford Square, behind its orderly face and its polished brass, a truth had been arranged to look like a discovery. The question Holmes had not yet answered, and which I suspected he had not yet resolved, was whether the arrangement was an act of justice or an act of something more personal, and whether those two things, in this particular instance, could be told apart. Chapter 4. A Death Too Convenient. Holmes was gone before I came down to breakfast the following morning. This was not unusual. When a case had taken sufficient hold of him, the ordinary rhythms of domestic life ceased to apply, and Mrs. Hudson had learned over the years to set a place for him at table without any particular expectation that he would occupy it. I ate alone, read the morning papers without finding anything that touched upon our inquiry, and was on my second cup of tea when he returned, shortly before 10, with the particular briskness of step that told me the morning had been productive. He shed his coat and hat, declined Mrs. Hudson's offer of breakfast with the brevity that she had also learned not to take personally, and sat down across from me with his hands upon his knees. "The ink," said he, without preamble. "What of it?" "The ink on the judicial order is not from the bottle in Peveril's desk-stand. The shade is marginally deeper, the oxidation slightly less advanced, and the composition, so far as I can determine from a comparison conducted under a good glass this morning, differs in the proportion of gall to vitriol. The document was signed with a different pen, dipped in a different ink than the one Peveril used habitually for legal papers." He paused, allowing the implication to settle. Whether that pen was Peveril's own or another's, I cannot yet say, but the order was not signed at that desk, or not with its customary instruments. I set down my cup. Then the date may not be the only thing that was altered. Precisely. We are no longer asking merely whether the 14th was changed to the 15th, or vice versa. We are asking whether any portion of the document, including the signature, reflects what it purports to reflect. He rose and went to the window, looking out at the grey street below. "I have also obtained, through Harrowby, the physician's full report on Peveril's death. Dr. Anstruther attended the household and has been their physician for 11 years. He is a thorough man and his report is detailed." He produced the document from his inside pocket and handed it to me. I read it with the attention the professional courtesy of one medical man to another demands, and found it, on the whole, consistent with what we had been told. Sir Reginald had dined alone that evening, his wife having retired early with a headache. He had been found by the manservant at 11 o'clock when the servant came to remove the tea things and bank the fire. He was seated at his desk, his head declined upon his chest, and had apparently been dead for some time. Anstruther had been summoned, had examined the body thoroughly, and had certified death from cardiac failure, noting that the heart had shown signs of significant deterioration consistent with the patient's age and history. "Nothing in this report strikes me as unreasonable," I said. "Nor me," said Holmes, "from a medical standpoint. Peveril was 71, had suffered 2 episodes of cardiac weakness in the preceding decade, and his physician expected, by his own admission, that the end might come without dramatic warning. I do not suggest that Peveril was assisted in dying, but I am interested in the circumstances that surrounded his last evening, and in particular in one detail that Anstruther's report does not address because Anstruther had no reason to consider it significant." He took back the report and indicated a line near the foot of the second page. "Anstruther notes the time of death as estimated between 9 and 11 o'clock in the evening. The manservant, when he entered at 11, found the room as he had left it when he brought the tea at 8:30, excepting one thing. The clock upon the study mantel had stopped. I recalled the clock. It had stood silent on our visit, its hands fixed, and I had taken it, without much thought, as a piece of furniture whose winding had been neglected in the distraction of a household in mourning. Stopped clocks are not uncommon, I said. They are not. But Laker, the manservant, told Lestrade that he had wound that clock himself on the morning of Peveril's death, as he did every Tuesday morning. It is, by his account, a reliable mechanism that has kept good time for 20 years. At 10:30, therefore, the clock stopped. Or more precisely, something happened at 10:30 that the clock recorded. You think it was interfered with? I think it is a question worth asking. A clock can stop from mechanical failure at any time, but a clock that was wound that morning and stops at precisely 10:30, on the evening when its owner dies and when, as I have established, the household was not entirely as still as it appeared, that clock interests me considerably. The household's movements on the night in question were, as Holmes then outlined them, as follows. Lady Marian had retired to her room at 7 o'clock, her headache being genuine according to the maid who brought her a tisane at 8. Arthur Peveril had been at his club until 10, as several members could attest. Miss Clara Vane had spent the evening in the upstairs sitting-room and had not, by her own account, descended to the ground floor after dinner. Reverend Bell had called at 7:30, spoken with Sir Reginald for approximately 30 minutes in the drawing-room, not the study, and left before 8. Jonas Thorne, however, had returned to the house at 9 o'clock, having left a set of papers he needed for an early appointment the following morning. He had spoken briefly with Peveril, collected his papers from the study, and departed. This much he had told Lestrade voluntarily, and it was consistent with what the manservant recalled, though the manservant had not seen Thorne leave, having been occupied in the kitchen. Thorne's estimate of the duration of his visit was 10 minutes, perhaps a little more. Thorne was in the study, I said. Thorne was in the study at 9 o'clock. Whether he was still there at 10:30 is a question nobody has yet thought to ask him directly, because Lestrade accepted his account without difficulty, and because the death is certified as natural. Holmes moved from the window and began filling his pipe, which I took as a sign that the morning's most urgent business was concluded and the ruminative phase was beginning. There is also this. When I examined the fireplace in the study, I found it had been recently cleaned, properly cleaned, in the ordinary course of household maintenance, but not entirely. In the far right corner of the grate, where the brush does not easily reach, there remained a small quantity of material that was not ordinary ash. He crossed to the mantelpiece and took down a folded paper packet, which he opened carefully on the table before me. Within it was a quantity of charred fragments, black and fragile, some no larger than a fingernail, others preserving a narrow strip of surface on which the ghost of ink marks was just barely visible. Paper, I said. Legal paper of the weight and texture used for formal submissions. I have not been able to read more than 3 partial words from the legible fragments, but those 3 words are sufficient. The first is petition, The second is appeal. The third, appearing on a separate fragment, is larch. Holmes refolded the packet with deliberate care. Somebody burned a document in that fireplace, Watson, and did not do so thoroughly enough. I looked at the charred remains and thought of Edwin Larch, dead in poor conditions, and of a petition filed before noon on the 15th of March in 1887, which had apparently never been heard. And I thought of Jonas Thorne, who had stood in that study at 9 o'clock in the evening with access to the fireplace, and who had told a policeman with unnecessary precision that he had not advanced beyond the door. Lestrade, I said, will not find this sufficient. Lestrade, Holmes replied, applying a match to his pipe, is not yet in possession of it. We shall give him the opportunity to catch up in due course. At present, I should like to know considerably more about Mr. Jonas Thorne than I presently do, and in particular about his father, regarding whom Harrowby made a passing remark that I did not find, upon reflection, nearly as incidental as it was delivered. He settled into his chair and drew upon his pipe, and the familiar blue thread of smoke rose slowly towards the ceiling. Outside, the January afternoon was already beginning its early retreat into dusk, and the lamps were being lit in the street below, their glow reflected in the wet stones. Somewhere a hansom moved through the slush, its wheels making that particular liquid sound that belongs to London in the cold months, and then it was gone. Holmes said nothing further, but the packet of charred fragments lay upon the table between us like an accusation, and I found myself thinking that whatever Sir Reginald Peveril had done with the law, something had been done in his study on the night of his death that went considerably beyond the rearrangement of papers. Chapter 5. Conscience Behind Politeness. We returned to Bedford Square the following morning under a sky the colour of old pewter, the cold having stiffened overnight into something more purposeful. Holmes had said little at breakfast beyond asking me to bring my notebook, which I took to mean that the day's work would involve more conversation than observation, and that he wished the record to be precise. He carried nothing himself beyond his stick and his customary air of unhurried certainty, which in my experience serves him better in an interview than any prepared list of questions. Harrowby received us in the hall, and informed us, with the apologetic manner of a young solicitor placed between two larger forces, that Inspector Lestrade had called that morning, and declared himself broadly satisfied with the circumstances of Sir Reginald's death. He had taken a brief statement from Thorne regarding the evening visit, noted it without apparent concern, and suggested that the matter of the judicial order be referred to the appropriate legal officers for review at their convenience. It was, he had told Harrowby, a matter for the courts rather than the police. Lestrade is not wrong, Holmes remarked, in a tone that made it clear he found Lestrade's conclusion accurate in its narrowest sense and inadequate in every other. However, the courts cannot review what they do not know, and there are several things they do not yet know. We shall begin with Lady Marian. She received us in the same drawing-room as before, the fire now burning more generously, and her composure, if anything, more thoroughly established. She was a woman who had clearly decided at some point in the recent past what manner of widow she intended to be, and was adhering to that decision with the same quiet firmness one imagined she had brought to the other decisions of a long and not uncomplicated marriage. Holmes did not begin with questions. He began by remarking, in a conversational manner, upon the legal history of the Peveril family's connection to certain charitable institutions in the East End, a subject he had evidently researched that morning and which was sufficiently unexpected to produce, in Lady Marian, a slight but genuine relaxation. She spoke of it with mild animation for perhaps 3 minutes, and then Holmes said, quite gently, "Your husband was lawful rather than kind, I think, Lady Marian. That is not a criticism. It is simply the description of a certain kind of man." She looked at him steadily. "It is a just description," she said. Reginald believed in the law as an instrument of civilization. He applied it without sentiment. I did not always find that easy to admire, but I understood it. "Did you admire him?" "I respected him." She paused. "They are not always the same thing." Holmes nodded as though this confirmed something he had already suspected. thanked her and moved on. He did not press her further on Peveril's character, and I noted that she had volunteered no defence of him beyond the factual. She had not, as many widows do, reached automatically for the consolations of retrospective devotion. Whatever her private judgment of her husband had been, she was not proposing to revise it now that he was dead. Arthur Peveril met us in the library, where he had been making preliminary notes regarding the estate. He rose when we entered, and his manner was that of a man making a considerable effort to appear at ease, which is never entirely the same as being so. He spoke of his uncle with measured respect, emphasizing the professional reputation and the orderly habits, and steering away with the practised smoothness of a man who has thought in advance about which currents to avoid from anything that might touch upon the Larch affair or the document that had been found. Holmes listened with apparent interest and then said, without any alteration of tone, "You're relieved, Mr. Peveril. Not, I think, by your uncle's death itself, which you are too decent a man to have wished for, but by something connected with it. I wonder whether you might tell me what that something is." Arthur was silent for a moment. Then he said, with more candour than I had expected, "I had believed, and there was some basis for the belief, that my uncle intended to alter his will in the final months of his life. The estate is not large, but it is not negligible. He had made remarks." He stopped. "As it happens, he did not make the alteration. The will stands as it was drawn 4 years ago. And had he made the alteration, who would have benefited?" Another pause. "I am not certain. The remarks were not specific." Holmes thanked him, and we withdrew. In the corridor he murmured to me, without breaking stride, "He is telling the truth about the will and lying about the specificity of the remarks, but neither fact is immediately relevant to the document." Miss Clara Vane received us in a small sitting room on the upper floor that had evidently been given over to her use, a neat, simply furnished space with a writing desk at the window and a shelf of books whose spines indicated serious rather than decorative reading. She was standing when we entered and remained standing, which I took to be a statement of intention rather than oversight. Holmes asked her, directly but without severity, how long she had known about Edwin Larch. The question landed with visible force. Her hands did not go to the gloves this time. They remained at her sides, but I saw them close slightly. "All my life," she said. "My father spoke of him often. He believed the conviction was unjust, and he believed that Sir Reginald knew it when he signed the order. And you?" "I believe what my father believed." She met Holmes's gaze without evasion. "I will not pretend otherwise. I have lived in this house for 6 years as Sir Reginald's ward, and I have been treated with every material comfort and no warmth whatsoever. And I have known the whole time that my father's ruin and Mr. Larch's imprisonment both passed across Reginald Peveril's desk and received his signature. You may draw what conclusions you like from that." "I draw none, as yet," Holmes said mildly. "I merely observe that strong feeling is not the same as guilt. Sometimes guilt hides in calmness and innocence breaks its composure." She looked at him with an expression that might have been surprise, and we left her. Jonas Thorne we found in the ground-floor corridor, apparently about to depart, his hat already in his hand and his walking stick. I attended to it carefully this time. Held loosely in his right, its metal ferrule showing the slight wear of a man who leans upon it more than he intends. He was willing to speak with us, he said, though he had already told the inspector everything of substance. Holmes asked him about his years with Sir Reginald, and Thorne answered at length and with evident feeling, describing the work of the household's legal affairs with the fidelity of a man for whom procedural precision was itself a form of loyalty. He had kept the papers, he had maintained the filing, he had ensured that every document was where it was required to be, when it was required to be there. A considerable responsibility, Holmes said, and never once in more than 20 years did you encounter a document that seemed to you to be irregular. The pause that followed was brief but sufficient. Sir Reginald was meticulous, Thorne said. That is not quite an answer to my question. It is the answer I am able to give. Holmes let it stand. He asked one further question, almost as an afterthought, as Thorn was moving towards the door. "Your father was in the legal profession, I believe, Mr. Thorn?" Thorn's hand tightened upon the stick. He was a clerk at the court offices for many years. "Precisely so," said Holmes, in the tone of a man who has just placed the final word of a sentence he had been composing for some time. "Thank you, Mr. Thorn. I think that will do for the present." Reverend Bell we left until last and found him in the drawing-room, where he had apparently been waiting with some anxiety. He had, Holmes told me afterwards, been in that room for the better part of an hour before our arrival, which the arrangement of the cushions upon the settee confirmed. He spoke at length of mercy, of the importance of charitable interpretation, of the dangers of judging a man's whole life by its least admirable moments. It was generous and sincere, and almost entirely general, and Holmes permitted him to speak without interruption. At the close of Bell's remarks, Holmes said only this: "You are afraid of something specific, Reverend. I do not yet know whether it is something you did, or something you know. The distinction matters rather more than you may suppose." Bell's broad face went briefly quite white. He said nothing, and we left him. In the cab returning to Baker Street, Holmes did not summarise and did not speculate aloud. He sat with his stick across his knees looking out at the London streets, and when I ventured the opinion that Clara Vane's reaction had pointed most directly towards the emotional centre of the matter, he shook his head with a slight, almost affectionate patience. "Watson," said he, "you are attending to the feeling which is natural in a humane man. I am attending to the fear, which is rather more instructive. 5 people in that house are frightened today who were merely careful 2 days ago. I should like to know what has happened between those 2 days to make the difference." He said nothing further until we reached Baker Street, and then went directly to his shelves without removing his coat. Chapter 6. Loyalty, Fear, and a Burned Petition. The question Holmes had posed in the cab, what had happened between our 2 visits to Bedford Square to sharpen careful reticence into something closer to fear, occupied me through the evening, and was still unresolved when I came down to breakfast the following morning to find that Holmes had already answered it, or at least had found the thread that would lead to the answer, and was sitting with 3 separate documents arranged before him on the cleared table with the satisfaction of a man who has spent a productive night. He did not invite me to examine them immediately. Instead, he poured coffee with unusual domestic attentiveness and said, "Tell me what you know of the court office system as it operated in the mid-1880s, Watson." I confessed that my knowledge of it was not detailed. "Then I shall supply the detail that is relevant," he settled back. The filing and registration of formal petitions at that period was conducted by a small staff of clerks who received documents, recorded their arrival in a ledger, and assigned them to the appropriate officer of the court. The ledger entry was the legal proof of receipt. Without it, a document might as well not have arrived. Its existence in the record was, for practical purposes, its existence in the world. He paused to allow this to settle. I saw where it was tending. And if the entry were not made, then the petition would have no official standing regardless of when it was physically delivered or how correctly it was prepared. Holmes tapped the uppermost document on the table. "I have spent a part of last night reviewing the court records from March of 1887, which Harrowby obtained for me yesterday afternoon when I asked him to, and which arrived here by messenger at 8 o'clock this evening while you were reading. The ledger entry for Larch's petition is dated the 15th of March as expected. The entry was made by a clerk whose name appears in the staff register of that period. That clerk's name was Thomas Thorn. The name required no gloss. I looked at Holmes and he met my gaze steadily. Jonas Thorn's father, I said, employed at the court office for 16 years. A reliable man by all the accounts I have been able to assemble. He registered the petition correctly on the 15th, as the ledger shows, and yet the petition was never heard, because on the same day, or if the order's date is to be believed the day before, Sir Reginald signed and issued his judicial order closing the matter. There was therefore a petition correctly received and correctly recorded, and a judicial order which, if it was genuinely dated the 14th, had been issued before the petition arrived, and could not have accounted for it. and if the order was actually signed on the 15th. Then Peveril signed it with full knowledge that a petition was before the court, and the date on the document was altered, either by him or by someone acting under his direction, to make the order appear prior to the petition. In that case, Thomas Thorne had registered a document that was subsequently made worthless by a legal instrument that was falsely dated. Holmes drew a slow breath. Thomas Thorne left the court office 6 months later. There is no formal record of dismissal. He resigned. His pension was small. His circumstances by the time he died in 1894 were considerably reduced from what they had been. I sat for a moment with the full weight of it. Thomas Thorne had done his work correctly, had recorded the petition faithfully, and had subsequently watched it count for nothing through a mechanism he may or may not have understood at the time. His son had then entered the service of the very man responsible, and had remained there for more than 20 years, maintaining that service with a fidelity that, as Holmes had suggested before and I now believed entirely, was something other than simple devotion. Jonas knew, I said. He knew what his father's connection to the case was. He knew what Peveril had done. I think he came to know, Holmes said carefully. Whether he knew when he first entered Peveril's employ, or whether he discovered it gradually, in the course of 2 decades of proximity to the man's papers and correspondence, I cannot yet determine. But I believe he knew with certainty for some time before Peveril's death, and that certainty is what shaped the arrangements we have been investigating. He rose and went to the window, the habitual post of his morning cogitations. The street below was quiet, a thin rain falling through the lamplight. Now, consider the access, he said. Thorne managed the papers. Thorne knew the filing system with the intimacy of long practice. Thorne was present in the study on the evening of Peveril's death, and Thorne, I have established, had also been to the house on the preceding Saturday, a visit not mentioned to Lestrade, but confirmed by the laundress who was working in the rear of the property that afternoon, and who spoke to Harrowby's clerk yesterday in the course of other inquiries. A second unacknowledged visit, I said, 2 days before the death. Exactly so, a visit during which I believe the groundwork of the arrangement was laid. The judicial order was placed in the folder marked for destruction. The blotter was replaced. The petition, or rather the copy of it that Thorne had obtained through his father's papers or through his own long access to the relevant files, was burned in the grate, not to destroy evidence of Peveril's guilt, mark you, but to destroy the copy that would have revealed Thorne's hand in the arrangement. The original petition remains in the court records. Its ledger entry is intact. Thorne did not need to destroy the evidence of Peveril's crime. He needed only to make the judicial order visible in such a way that the inquiry which followed would find it, while removing the traces of his own involvement in its placement. It was the most complete account Holmes had yet offered, and I was silent for a moment in consideration of it. Then the object was exposure, I said. He wished Peveril's corruption to come to light. That was one object. Holmes turned from the window, but not, I think, the whole of it. Consider what the arrangement actually achieves. The order is found, the inquiry begins, the date discrepancy is examined. If the ink analysis confirms what I believe it will confirm, that the document was not signed with Peveril's habitual instruments, the question of authenticity becomes acute. But Thorne is not identified as having placed it there, and the misdating is attributed to Peveril rather than to any subsequent hand. He paused. Except that there is a further complication, which I did not see until last night. He took up the second document from the table, a folded sheet covered in his own closely written annotations. The ink, Watson. I said the order was signed with a different ink than Peveril used habitually. But consider the implication in the other direction. If the order was signed by Peveril with a different pen and ink, that is one matter. If it was signed, or its date altered, by someone other than Peveril, with an approximation of his hand, that is another matter entirely. I have studied the signature under considerable magnification. There are 2 points at which the pen hesitates very slightly, in a manner inconsistent with a man writing his own name with habitual ease. The implication was considerable. I chose my words with care. You're suggesting the signature itself may be imperfect. I am suggesting it bears examination that I am not, in honesty, qualified to conclude without expert assistance. I have written this morning to a man in the Strand who is. Holmes set the paper down. What I can say with confidence is this. The arrangement in that study was careful, patient, and designed by someone with an intimate knowledge of legal documents, of Peveril's habits and methods, and of the specific facts of the Larch case. The burned fragments were intended to be found as confirmation of guilt, not as evidence of tampering. The placement of the order was meant to look like Peveril's own guilty conscience made manifest, or like a disclosure arranged by someone with access to his private papers, but no knowledge of their legal significance. He settled into his chair and pressed his fingertips together. Someone, in short, wished us to believe that the document had arranged itself to be discovered. The difficulty is that documents do not arrange themselves, and the person who arranged this one understood the law, the household, and the history of a 30-year-old injustice with a thoroughness that points in one direction only. And yet, I said, returning to what troubled me most, if Jonas Thorne arranged all of this to expose Peveril's guilt, the guilt he is exposing is real. Peveril did this. Larch suffered for it. His own father was diminished by proximity to it. Holmes looked at me with an expression that was, for him, unusually sombre. Yes, said he quietly, and that is precisely what makes it complicated. The lie is in the service of a truth. The manipulation points toward a genuine wrong, and the man who conducted it has spent 20 years living in the shadow of a crime he could not prove and could not forgive. He was silent for a moment. I do not find it simple, Watson. I do not think it is meant to be. Outside, the rain had ceased, leaving the street below bright and washed and cold, each stone distinct in the clear morning light. Chapter 7. The Convenient Confession. It was Harrowby who sent word, arriving at Baker Street by the afternoon post in the form of a brief note written in the hurried hand of a man conveying news he's not certain how to characterize. Reverend Silas Bell had called upon him that morning at his offices in Gray's Inn, had asked to make a statement, and had proceeded to deliver one of considerable length and apparent candour. Harrowby had taken it down, had formed the view that it was material, and wondered whether Mr. Holmes might consent to review it at his earliest convenience. Holmes read the note, passed it to me without comment, and was reaching for his coat before I had finished it. We found Harrowby in his office, surrounded by the organised disorder of a professional man in the middle of a complicated week. The statement, written out in Harrowby's neat legal hand and already signed by Bell, lay at the centre of his desk. Holmes picked it up without ceremony and read it standing, which he does when he wishes to form a rapid, rather than a settled impression. I read it after him, seated. Bell's account was, in its outline, as follows. He had been a close friend of Sir Reginald's for 3 decades, a friendship maintained across considerable differences of temperament and opinion. In the later years of that friendship, as Peveril's health declined, and he spent more of his time in retrospective thought, certain matters had been raised between them in the context of private spiritual counsel. Bell was careful, in the statement, to characterize these conversations as falling within the spirit, though not the strict legal form of pastoral confidence. What he had to say was offered in the belief that the dead were beyond the reach of prosecution, and that the living deserved the truth. Sir Reginald, Bell stated, had expressed in his final months a private acknowledgment that the Larch affair had not reflected well upon him. He had not used the word wrongdoing, Bell noted, but had employed formulations of regret sufficiently specific to leave little doubt about their referent. He had spoken of a date, of a document, of a decision made quickly and confirmed rather than reconsidered when reconsideration might still have served justice. He had not confessed to deliberate falsification, but he had admitted that the timing of the order and the manner in which the petition had been rendered moot had been driven by considerations that were not purely judicial. After Peveril's death, Bell continued, he had found himself in an acute difficulty of conscience. He knew that the judicial order lay among the papers, and he knew broadly what it signified. He could not speak of what Peveril had told him without betraying a confidence, and yet he could not allow the document to remain buried and the Larch case to stay permanently closed when an innocent man's reputation and that of his family had been damaged by a proceeding whose legitimacy was doubtful. His solution, which he acknowledged was imperfect, had been to locate the folder containing the order during his private visit to the house on the evening following Peveril's death, and to move it from the lower drawer where it had been filed to the surface of the desk, where it would be visible to anyone conducting a thorough examination of the papers. He had not altered the document. He had not spoken of its significance to anyone in the household. He had simply made it discoverable and trusted that discovery would follow. He concluded by expressing his willingness to submit to whatever professional or legal consequences might attach to this admission, and by stating that his purpose had been exclusively the service of truth. Harrowby looked at us across his desk with the expression of a man who has received an answer, and is not entirely certain it is the answer to the question he asked. "It is," he said, choosing his words carefully, "a complete account of how the document came to be found, and it is consistent with everything the household has told us." Holmes set down the statement and stood for a moment looking at the window, which gave onto a narrow Gray's Inn courtyard, where a pair of pigeons were conducting their own apparently inconclusive investigation of the cobblestones. "It is consistent," he said, "with everything the household has told us, yes. It also happens to be consistent with everything a reasonably intelligent person who had read the household's accounts would construct if they needed an explanation that covered the physical facts of the document's discovery without touching any of the physical facts of the study." Harrowby blinked. "You doubt it?" "I find it admirably convenient," Holmes said. "Reverend Bell's statement explains the document's presence on the desk. It explains his nervousness. It provides a narrative of conscience and repentance that satisfies the moral requirements of the situation and transforms what might be considered interference with a private household's papers into an act of virtuous disclosure. It gives Lady Marian a story of her husband's private remorse to replace the starker alternative. It gives Arthur Peveril reassurance that the scandal can be contained within the register of penitence rather than fraud. It gives Miss Vane what appears to be confirmation of what she has always believed." He turned from the window. "It satisfies everyone, Harrowby. In my experience, an explanation that satisfies everyone is precisely the explanation that satisfies truth, least of all." Harrowby looked down at the statement with renewed uncertainty. "But if Bell did not move the document, who did?" Holmes did not answer directly. He asked instead whether Bell had specified, in his statement, which evening he had visited the house after Peveril's death, and Harrowby confirmed that Bell had stated it was the evening of the day following, when he had called to offer his condolences and had been left briefly alone in the study while the manservant went to announce him to Lady Marian. "A brief moment alone," Holmes said. "Sufficient to move a folder from a drawer to the desktop. Yes, it is entirely plausible. A man of Bell's build and years could accomplish it without difficulty, and no one would have marked it." He picked up his hat. "The question is not whether Bell could have done it, Harrowby. It is whether Bell needed to." In the cab returning to Baker Street, I attempted to organise my thinking. The difficulty was not that Bell's confession was implausible. It was, as Holmes had said, entirely plausible, and in a different case I should have accepted it without reservation. The difficulty was that it was too neatly suited to its purpose. It answered every surface question while leaving the physical anomalies, the ink, the replaced blotter, the stopped clock, the burned fragments, precisely where they were, without addressing them. Bell's account required only that he had moved a folder. It did not require, and didn't explain, the wrong ink, or the new blotter cut from a larger sheet, or the fragments in the grate that bore the word petition in a hand that was not Bell's. "He is covering for someone," I said. Holmes looked at me with what I can only describe as measured approval. "That is my view also. Whether knowingly, or because he has been encouraged to believe that his version is the complete one, I am not yet certain. Bell is a man of genuine conscience, Watson, which makes him both a plausible confessor and a useful instrument for someone who needed a conscience to place in front of an investigation. Thorn, I said. I should be very surprised if it were anyone else. Holmes looked out at the street where a newspaper seller was crying an afternoon edition in the raw air. Bell's statement will satisfy Lestrade entirely, I have no doubt. It will close the immediate question of how the document was found, and will redirect attention toward the moral history of the Larch case, which is where Thorn wishes it to be directed. The legal officers will review the order. The original conviction will be re-examined. Peveril's reputation will be quietly revised, and the man who arranged the entire proceeding will return to private life with his father's humiliation addressed, and his own hands, in the legal sense, entirely clean. He was silent for a moment. A cart had stopped ahead of us, and the cab was obliged to wait, the horse shifting with patient resignation in the cold. "And you will not permit that," I said. It was not quite a question. "I will not permit a falsehood to serve as the foundation of a true conclusion," Holmes said. "The truth about Peveril's guilt does not require a manufactured discovery to support it. The court records are there, the ledger entry is there, the ink analysis will be there. If the Larch case is to be reopened, and I believe it should be, it ought to be reopened on honest ground, not on an arrangement that is itself a kind of deception, however sympathetic its author." He settled back as the cab began to move again. "Besides which, Watson, there is still the matter of the clock, and of what was behind it, which Bell's statement does not begin to address, and which I intend to examine tonight." I said nothing further, but I found myself thinking of Reverend Bell, who was in all probability a good man, and who had spent the better part of a week in a state of considerable private anguish, and who had emerged from it with a confession that was not quite false, and not quite complete, offered in the genuine belief that it was the most that could be said without causing harm that outweighed the good. I thought it very likely that he believed what he had told Harrowby, and I thought it almost equally likely that he did not know the whole of what he was protecting. The cab turned into Baker Street, and Holmes was out of it almost before it stopped. Chapter 8. The Dust Beneath the Clock. Holmes would not tell me that evening how he proposed to examine the study at Bedford Square, and I didn't press him. There are moments in a case when his methods require a privacy of execution that I have learned to respect, not because he excludes me from any want of trust, but because the particular quality of attention he brings to a physical problem is one that company, even sympathetic company, tends to disturb. He left Baker Street at 9 o'clock carrying nothing but his lens and his stick, declined a cab with a gesture, and walked out into the cold London night with the unhurried purposefulness of a man on a familiar errand. I read until midnight and then slept, and he was back before I came down in the morning, seated at the breakfast table with a cup of cold tea at his elbow, and the look of a man who's been awake for a considerable number of consecutive hours, and has found it entirely worthwhile. On the table before him, arranged with the careful spacing of exhibits, were 3 objects. The first was a small quantity of reddish sealing wax, perhaps half the size of a shirt button, pressed onto a slip of white paper to preserve it. The second was a tiny fragment of blue paper, not much larger than a postage stamp, with one straight-cut edge suggesting it had been torn rather than folded from a larger sheet. The third was a sheet of Holmes's own notepaper, on which he had drawn, in his precise draftsman's hand, a diagram of the study mantelpiece, with measurements annotated in pencil along the base and sides. I sat down and examined these items while he refilled his cup from the pot which Mrs. Hudson had apparently refreshed not long before my arrival. "Behind the clock," he said, without preamble. "You moved it." "I moved it with Harrowby's written permission, obtained yesterday afternoon against this eventuality." He came to the table and sat across from me, indicating the diagram. The clock stands on a marble shelf approximately 14 inches deep. Its base is 6 inches by 4. When I lifted it, and it is heavier than it appears, a quality movement in an oak case, I found, on the marble directly beneath it, a rectangle of perfectly clean stone. The surrounding shelf carries a uniform film of fine dust, as one would expect. That rectangle is free of it entirely, which means the clock was moved recently enough that the dust has not had time to resettle, Not weeks, days. He indicated the sealing wax. This was adhering to the inner rear face of the clock's base, caught in a slight roughness of the wood. It is not the wax used in this household's correspondence. I have compared the colour and composition to the sealing wax in Peveril's desk, which is a dark burgundy of a common pattern. This is a brighter red, slightly softer in consistency, indicating a higher proportion of shellac. It is the kind used for securing folded documents that must be opened repeatedly, rather than sealed permanently. A document that was folded and placed beneath the clock, I said. Placed there, then removed. The wax transferred to the clock's base when the document was pressed down and the clock replaced above it. The document itself is gone, retrieved at some point between its concealment and my examination, but it was there long enough to leave its trace. He tapped the blue paper fragment. This was caught in a slight gap where the mantelpiece meets the chimney breast. It matches in colour and weight the kind of thin blue paper used by one particular firm of law stationers in Chancery Lane for the covers of bound legal submissions. I have used their materials myself upon occasion. I looked at the blue fragment and thought of the legal submissions I had seen in the course of this inquiry, the folders in Peveril's study, the petition referenced in the charred remains from the grate. Another document, I said, something folded in a blue cover. The original, or a copy, of something pertaining to the Larch case, not the petition itself, which as I have established is in the court records and would serve no purpose here in duplicate. Something else, a letter perhaps, or a private memorandum. Holmes drank his tea thoughtfully. Thorne retrieved it during his visit on the night of Peveril's death, or possibly during the unacknowledged visit 2 days prior. He placed it beneath the clock for concealment during one visit, and collected it during another, and was not sufficiently careful in either operation to prevent these traces. The picture it assembled was remarkably precise. Thorne had used the clock, a heavy, settled, permanent-seeming object of the kind nobody disturbs without specific purpose, as a temporary safe. Whatever the blue-covered document contained, it had been important enough to conceal on the premises while other arrangements were being made, and important enough to retrieve before any formal examination of the study could be conducted. The carpet mark, I said, recalling Holmes's observation during our first visit, when he had crouched briefly near the desk leg. You said then that it interested you. The carpet directly before the fireplace bears 2 distinct impressions from a metal ferrule. One is consistent with a person standing at the fireplace in the ordinary way, which might be anyone. The second is some 18 inches to the left of the first, beside the desk, which is not where a visitor stands unless he has business at the desk or the fireplace surround, and not where Jonas Thorne claims to have stood, having told Lestrade that he remained by the door throughout his visit. Holmes set down his cup. 2 ferrule marks, Watson. Either Thorne moved during his visit, or a second person with a metal-tipped stick visited the study that evening. Since no other visitor with such a stick has been identified, the probability is plain. He was at the desk, I said, not at the door. He was at the desk, and he was at the mantelpiece. In both positions he was doing something that required him to be there physically, not merely to step in and collect papers as he described. The stopped clock is now explicable in its most probable form. The movement was not wound down and was not interfered with mechanically. In replacing the clock after retrieving the document from beneath it, Thorne nudged the pendulum sufficiently to arrest it. He did not notice, or did not have sufficient light to notice, and the clock recorded the moment of his clumsiness with the impartiality of good mechanism. 10:30, I said, an hour and a half after he told Lestrade he had left. Or he returned. I cannot yet say with certainty which, though the Saturday visit inclines me to the former. Holmes rose and moved to the window with the energy of a man approaching the outer boundary of what his evidence currently permits. What I can say is this. Thorne was in that study for longer, and conducting more, than a brief visit to collect papers. He burned the document in the grate. He placed and later retrieved the blue-covered document from beneath the clock. He replaced the blotter. He arranged the judicial order in its folder. He did all of this with patience and deliberateness. And then he told Lestrade a story sufficiently close to the truth to be unverifiable on its surface. I looked at the 3 exhibits on the table, the wax, the paper, the diagram, and thought about the quality of planning they implied. This was not the work of a man acting on impulse, driven by sudden emotion to rearrange the evidence of a long-standing wrong. This was the work of a man who had considered the matter over time, who understood the legal system well enough to know precisely which traces would lead where, and who had designed an outcome as carefully as the magistrate he served had once designed a judicial order. "He is a clerk," I said, half to myself. "He thinks in documents and procedures." "He thinks," Holmes said, in the same language as the crime he's addressing, which is what makes him both effective and ultimately legible. He turned from the window. "I shall need one further piece of evidence before I am ready to lay the matter before those who must act on it. My man in the Strand has completed his examination of the signature on the judicial order, and I have arranged to collect his report this afternoon. Depending on its contents, the conversation with Jonas Thorne will take place either tomorrow or the day after." He said it with the quietness of a man approaching the end of something that has required considerable care, and I felt it too. That peculiar sobriety of a case nearing its resolution, when the satisfaction of answered questions is inseparable from the weight of what the answers mean for the people involved. I thought of Thorne, spare and upright in the doorway of the study with his stick in his hand, loyalty and injury in equal measure written in the lines of his face. I thought of Thomas Thorne, who had correctly recorded a petition in a ledger 30 years before, and had paid a price for his proximity to what followed. And I thought of Edwin Larch, who had paid a far heavier one. Outside the day was clear and cold, the kind of January morning that offers light without warmth, every roofline and chimney pot sharp against a pale blue sky. Holmes put on his coat, pocketed his lens, and took up his hat with the manner of a man with one remaining piece of work to do. Chapter 9. Holmes names the guilty hand. The expert in the Strand was a Mr. Clement Burr, whose connection to the legal world was that of a handwriting examiner of some considerable standing, retained over the years by several of the Inns of Court, and by at least 2 government departments whose names he declined to specify, but whose requirements I gathered were exacting. Holmes had used his services twice before in matters I'm not at liberty to detail, and regarded him, in the precise and limited way Holmes regards any specialist, with the respect due to a man who knows his ground thoroughly and does not venture beyond it. Burr's report occupied 4 closely written pages. Holmes read it in the cab returning from the Strand, said nothing, folded it with care, and placed it in his inside pocket with the deliberateness of a man securing the last piece of a mechanism before setting it in motion. He did not speak again until we were at Baker Street, and then only to tell me that we would go to Bedford Square the following morning, and that I should be prepared for a conversation of some length and considerable delicacy. I did not sleep well that night. The case had settled into my mind in a way that the purely criminal ones rarely do, because the wrong at its centre was not simple, and the man at its circumference was not a villain of the ordinary type. By the time I came down to breakfast, I had formed a clear enough view of the whole to understand what Holmes was going to say, and a sufficiently human response to the matter to feel the weight of his saying it. We arrived at Bedford Square at 10:30. Harrowby had assembled the household at Holmes's written request, and they were gathered in the drawing-room much as they had been on our first visit, with the difference that the tension in the room had shifted from careful composure to something rawer and less contained. Belle sat apart from the others. Clara Vane had chosen a chair near the window and was looking out at the bare garden. Lady Marian occupied her accustomed position near the fire with the stillness of a woman who has decided that stillness is the only form of dignity remaining to her. Arthur stood near the door. Lestrade was present, having been invited by Holmes on the grounds of professional necessity, and received the invitation with the wary enthusiasm of a man who has learned that Holmes's courtesies generally precede his corrections. Jonas Thorne sat in the centre of the room, his stick between his knees and his hands upon its head, and when Holmes entered he looked up with an expression I had not seen on him before. It was not fear exactly, and it was not defiance. It was the expression of a man who has been expecting a reckoning for so long that its arrival comes as something not entirely unlike relief. Holmes stood before the cold fireplace and spoke without theatrical preamble. "I am going to describe what occurred in this house over the course of the past several weeks," he said, "and I should be grateful if those present would correct me where I am mistaken. I expect to be corrected very little." He began with Peveril. The judicial order, he explained with the clarity he brings to complex exposition when he has no interest in obscuring it, had been signed by Sir Reginald on the 15th of March, 1887, not the 14th. The date on the document, in the form in which it had been found, was not the date on which the document had been executed. The difference had been achieved by altering the numeral, a task requiring a steady hand, a close match of ink, and familiarity with the pen habits of the signatory. Holmes did not yet specify who had altered it, and I noticed that several people in the room adjusted their posture at this point, each in a slightly different way. He then addressed the petition. Thomas Thorne, he said quietly, had correctly registered the large petition on the morning of the 15th, as the court ledger confirmed. Sir Reginald had been aware of its existence when he signed the order closing the matter. His decision to proceed, and to preserve the appearance of legal priority by means of an altered date, had deprived a man of his final lawful recourse, and had exposed a faithful court officer to the humiliation of having performed his duty to no effect. Lady Marian's hands, I noticed, had tightened slightly in her lap. She did not speak. Holmes then described the arrangement in the study. He laid out the sequence with the precision of a man reconstructing a mechanism. The unacknowledged visit on the Saturday, the placement of the blue-covered document beneath the clock, the burning of the petition copy in the grate, the replacement of the blotter, the positioning of the judicial order in its labelled folder, the second visit on the night of Peveril's death, the retrieval of the concealed document, the ferrule marks in the carpet, and the stopped clock with its testimony of 10:30. The clock, Holmes said, was not interfered with deliberately. It recorded, with the indifference of good mechanism, the moment at which the person replacing it caused the pendulum to arrest. That moment was an hour and a half later than the time at which that person had told the police he departed. Thorne had not moved throughout this recital. He sat with his hands on his stick and his eyes on Holmes, and his face had the quality of a man listening to a faithful account of something he himself remembers clearly. The arrangement, Holmes continued, was designed to expose Sir Reginald's guilt while directing suspicion away from the man who had uncovered it. The burned fragments were intended to be found as corroboration of the original wrong, not as evidence of recent interference. The document's placement in the destruction folder was designed to suggest that it had been preserved against Peveril's own instruction, perhaps by a guilty conscience, perhaps by providential chance. Reverend Bell's confession, which I do not believe was fabricated, but which I do believe was gently encouraged by a person who knew Bell's conscience well enough to know what direction it would take when pressed, provided an explanation of the discovery that covered the moral ground without touching the physical evidence. Bell made a small sound, not quite a word, and pressed his lips together. The object, Holmes said, was to reopen the Larch case through the document's discovery, to allow Peveril's guilt to emerge through the normal processes of legal review, and to accomplish justice for a man who had died without it, and for a family that had been diminished in its service. He paused. The means employed involved the falsification of evidence in the arrangement of the study, the concealment and retrieval of a private document, and the deliberate construction of a misleading account offered to a police inspector. He turned to Thorne directly for the first time. The signature on the judicial order, Mr. Thorne, is not entirely Sir Reginald's. The bulk of the document is his, and the content is his, and the moral guilt is his. But the alteration of the date involved a partial retracing of the numeral, and the pen that did it was not held by the same hand that signed the name. The hesitations in the strokes are consistent with a person writing with deliberate care in an unfamiliar context. A handwriting examiner of considerable experience has reached the same conclusion from an independent examination. The date was altered after Peveril's death, not before it. Thorne looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, in a voice that was entirely level and entirely without self-pity, he had already altered it himself. 30 years ago, when he signed the order on the 15th and wrote the 14th, The numeral was already wrong. I returned it to what it should have been, to the truth. The room was very quiet. Holmes said carefully, "You altered a legal document. Whatever it previously contained, and whatever the original wrong it recorded, you altered it. You burned evidence in a man's fireplace. You misled a police inspector. You arranged a false context of discovery. And you did all of this in the service of a conclusion that the evidence, honestly presented, was sufficient to support without any of it." "I didn't know at the time whether it was sufficient," Thorne said. "I knew that men like Peveril are not undone by honest evidence alone. I knew how the law protects those who know how to use it." A pause. "My father knew it too." "Your father," Holmes said more quietly, "did his work correctly. That is what the record shows, and what the record will continue to show." He looked at Thorne for a moment with an expression that was not without sympathy, though it was also not without firmness. "The Larch case can be reopened. The court records are sufficient. The ink analysis and the handwriting examination are, taken together, capable of establishing what Peveril did. You were not wrong about the injustice, Mr. Thorne. You were wrong about the method." Lestrade stepped forward at this point with the expression of a man resuming professional ground after a period of enforced spectating. Holmes had a brief word with him in the corridor. I didn't hear all of it, but I heard enough to understand that he was urging consideration of motive and circumstance in whatever course Lestrade chose to recommend, and that Lestrade, to his credit, was listening with more than his usual receptiveness. When I returned to the drawing-room, Clara Vane was standing by the window with her arms at her sides and her eyes bright with something that was not quite grief, and not quite relief, but occupied the difficult ground between them. Lady Marian had not moved. Arthur had sat down at last. Bell was staring at the floor with the expression of a man reconstructing a recent conversation, in a considerably altered light. I found, standing in that room, that I had no clear judgment to offer, which was itself, I supposed, a kind of judgment. Chapter 10. Watson reflects on law and mercy. The weeks that followed the gathering in Bedford Square moved at the measured pace of institutional process, which is to say they moved slowly, and with the particular quality of resolution that belongs not to the dramatic moment of revelation, but to the long, unglamorous work of consequence. I have recorded many of Holmes's cases in which the denouement arrives with a certain completeness, the guilty party removed, the innocent vindicated, the machinery of justice visibly engaged. This case afforded no such clean geometry. What it offered instead was something closer to the truth of how justice actually moves in the world, haltingly, partially, and with a permanent awareness of what it cannot undo. Jonas Thorne was arrested on the third day after our gathering, on charges relating to the falsification of a legal document and the provision of a misleading statement to a police inspector. Lestrade managed the matter with a quietness that I thought well of him for, making no public announcement and conducting the proceedings with a sobriety that suggested he had taken Holmes's private words in the corridor rather more seriously than his customary manner might have promised. The charges, as they stood, were not negligible, but neither were they of the gravest kind, and Harrowby, whose firm's interests were sufficiently entangled with the matter to justify his continued involvement, engaged counsel of considerable ability on Thorne's behalf. Holmes submitted a written account of his findings to the relevant authorities, together with Burr's handwriting report, the ink analysis, and a precise reconstruction of the sequence of events in the study. He also submitted as an appendix a summary of the Larch case, the court ledger entries, and the evidence bearing upon Sir Reginald's conduct in the matter of the petition. He did this without being asked, and without drawing particular attention to the act. He mentioned it to me briefly, in the tone he uses for administrative completeness, and said nothing further on the subject. The Larch case was reopened in February, referred through a mechanism of legal review that Harrowby navigated with the careful competence of a young solicitor who has found himself unexpectedly in a case of significance, and is determined to acquit himself well. The inquiry took rather longer than anyone had hoped, and rather less long than anyone had feared. Its conclusions, when they came, were not framed as a direct repudiation of Peveril's conduct. The dead are, as Bell had noted, beyond prosecution, but the language in which they addressed the original proceedings left very little doubt as to their import. The conviction of Edwin Larch was set aside. The record was amended. Whatever comfort can be offered to a man 30 years dead by a document that arrives in his absence, it was offered. The effect upon those still living was various. Lady Marian received the outcome with the same composed sobriety she had brought to everything since her husband's death, and I suspected that her private response to the revised account of his conduct was more nuanced than her public one. She had told Holmes on that first visit that she had respected rather than loved her husband, and that the two were not the same thing. I think she had known, in the particular way of a long-married intelligent woman, that there were parts of his professional life she had chosen not to examine too closely, and that the inquiry had made that choice no longer available to her. She bore it, from what I observed, with a kind of grief that was as much for the choice as for the man. Arthur Peveril found that the estate, when properly examined in the altered circumstances, was somewhat less straightforward than he had anticipated, certain property transfers requiring review in the light of the reopened inquiry. This caused him considerable inconvenience and some financial uncertainty of a temporary kind, none of which he handled with any great distinction. Holmes, when I mentioned this, observed that Arthur was not a bad man but an ungifted one, and that the combination is more common than the moralists allow for. Clara Vane left Bedford Square in early February, having made arrangements of her own that I only partially understood, and took rooms in a quiet part of Bloomsbury. I encountered her once by chance some weeks later in the reading room of the British Museum, where she was engaged with a volume of legal history whose title I caught a glimpse of and found entirely in character. She looked at ease in a manner she had not in that drawing-room, and I thought the freedom from the house in Bedford Square, with all its weight of complicit history, had agreed with her. We exchanged a few words of courtesy and parted without dwelling on the matter that had connected us. There are encounters that carry their shared history without needing to rehearse it, and that was one of them. Reverend Bell called upon Holmes at Baker Street in March. Somewhat to my surprise, I was present, and watched the two of them with the interest of a man observing a conversation between two people who understand each other rather better than either finds entirely comfortable. Bell had come, I think, to offer something between an apology and an explanation, though in the end what he offered was simply the acknowledgement that he had allowed his understanding of Thorn's conscience to substitute, without sufficient examination, for his understanding of Thorn's actions. Holmes received this without either absolution or reproach, offered him tea, and spoke for 20 minutes on an entirely unrelated subject. Bell left looking somewhat lighter than when he arrived, which I took to be the intended effect. Thorn's case came to its conclusion in April. The judge, who had evidently read the submissions with attention and was not insensible to the moral complexity of the situation, imposed a sentence that reflected the formal gravity of the offence without any apparent desire to make an example of its author. Thorn bore himself through the proceedings with the same upright, lined composure he had brought to everything, and when the outcome was delivered he received it without visible reaction, which is either the mark of a man at peace with consequences, or a man long accustomed to feelings that show less on the surface than they cost beneath it. I was not able to determine which, and I am not sure the distinction, in his case, would have been easy to draw even under closer observation. I returned to Baker Street from the final hearing to find Holmes at his chemical bench, in the attitude of a man who has been thinking rather than working, the experiment before him apparently untouched. I sat down and told him the outcome, which he had not attended, having declared himself satisfied with the evidential portion of the proceedings and uninterested in their ceremonial conclusion. He listened without interrupting, and when I had finished he was silent for a moment. "Law is a machine, Watson," he said at last, not with the epigram's usual crispness, but with something more considered behind it. A necessary one, and on the whole a remarkable one, given what it is asked to do. But justice is not a machine. It requires truth first, mercy after, and reason always, and these three things are not always easily arranged in their proper order." He turned back to his bench. I looked out at Baker Street, where the April afternoon had brought the particular quality of London light that belongs to that season, warmer than it has any right to be, and full of the intimation of change. A hansom moved past below, and somewhere a window was opened, and the faint sounds of the street shifted with it. I thought about Edwin Larch, who had not lived to see the record corrected. I thought about Thomas Thorne, who had registered a petition correctly in a ledger and lost his livelihood in the aftermath of doing so, and who had never, so far as any record showed, made any formal complaint or demanded any recognition of what had been done to him. I thought about his son, who had carried the knowledge of it through 20 years of service to the man responsible, and had finally acted in the only way he knew how to act, which was through documents and procedures and the careful arrangement of evidence, which is to say through the same language in which the original wrong had been committed. I thought about Peveril, who had applied the law without mercy, and had found that the law, applied to himself at a distance of 30 years, was not entirely merciful in return. None of it resolved into anything simple, which is perhaps why it has stayed with me longer than cases that yielded cleaner conclusions. Holmes, I suspect, found it no less troubling, though his manner of carrying such things is not my own. He mentioned the case once more, some months later, in the context of a quite different inquiry, and did so not to illuminate the new case, but apparently from some private process of recollection he had not intended to make audible. He said only that it was important to distinguish between a man who pursues justice dishonestly and a man who pursues dishonesty in the name of justice, and that the distinction, while philosophically clear, is not always easy to maintain in the presence of the human particulars. I agreed with him then, and I agree with him now, but I would add, for my own part, that the human particulars are precisely where all such questions actually live, and that any account of justice which does not begin with them is an account of something else entirely. Holmes made no response to this observation. He had, by the time I made it, returned entirely to his experiment, and the blue thread of smoke rising slowly from the retort told me that the matter of the misdated judicial order had been filed in whatever part of that extraordinary mind receives the cases that do not resolve into simple satisfaction, and placed beside the others there where it would remain.